Story number 1.
The summer I turned 19, I worked as a camp counselor at a small, remote summer camp nestled deep in the forests of northern Michigan. The camp was called Pine Brook, and it had a long history. Built in the 1920s, it had hosted generations of kids during the warm months. It was a place of tall pines, winding dirt roads, and a lake so clear it seemed to mirror the sky. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. My job was straightforward: supervise the boys for our cabin, organize activities, keep the fires burning, and make sure the kids didn't get into trouble. Most days were uneventful, filled with swimming lessons, arts and crafts, and campfire songs. But there was something about Pine Brook that felt off. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a shadow lingering just outside your vision. The camp was surrounded by thick woods, and the staff were strict about not wandering beyond the marked trails. There was one trail, though, that no one was supposed to take. It was called the Old Logging Road, and the counselors warned us never to go near it. They said it was dangerous, unstable, and off limits because of past accidents. That only made me more curious. One particularly hot July afternoon, I was on cabin duty, and most of the kids were at swimming. A handful of them, though, kept sneaking away to explore, and I had to keep an eye out. One boy, Tommy, about 10 years old, was especially restless. He kept talking about a secret path he'd heard about from older kids, a way to get to a hidden clearing with wild berries and an abandoned cabin. Despite the warnings, that afternoon I decided to check it out. I told Tommy to stay close and not wander off, but his excitement was contagious. We slipped away from the main campgrounds and found the narrow trail that matched the description. The old logging road was overgrown, the trees arching overhead to form a natural tunnel. The air grew cooler beneath the canopy, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and distant bird calls. As we walked, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The place had a strange stillness, as if the forest was holding its breath. After about 15 minutes, we reached a clearing. There, half swallowed by vines and moss, was the skeleton of a small wooden cabin. The roof had collapsed, and the walls were crumbling, but it was unmistakably a human structure. Tommy ran to a patch of wild berries, plucking a few and popping them into his mouth. As I surveyed the scene, I noticed something odd: a small wooden box on the ground near the cabin's entrance. It was carved with intricate symbols, faded and worn by time. I picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside were several old photographs, yellowed with age, showing a family posing by the lake, smiling. One photo stood out: a boy about Tommy's age, standing in front of the cabin, his eyes dark and hollow. A sudden chill ran through me, though the sun was blazing overhead. I told Tommy we should head back before anyone noticed we were gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The photos haunted my thoughts, especially the boy's face. I showed the box and photos to one of the senior counselors, Mark. His expression turned grim. "That cabin was owned by the Peterson family," he said quietly. "Their son Daniel disappeared here nearly 70 years ago. They never found him. The family left soon after." I asked if anyone ever saw Daniel again. Mark shook his head. "Some say his spirit still roams the woods, looking for someone to help him find peace." I laughed nervously, but something about his tone chilled me. The next few days brought strange occurrences. I'd hear footsteps outside the cabin at night, light, quick, like a child running. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. The kids began to whisper about the woods ghost, saying they heard singing and crying near the old logging road. One night, Tommy disappeared. We had a full search party out, calling his name into the dark forest. The camp was in chaos. Hours later, just before dawn, Tommy staggered back to camp, eyes wide with terror. He wouldn't talk about where he'd been, only that he saw a boy in the woods who told him to leave. I knew then that Daniel's spirit was real. Determined to put an end to it, I returned to the cabin alone one evening. The forest was unnervingly silent. I placed the photos and the wooden box on the decayed porch, hoping to give Daniel's spirit something to hold on to, a link to his past life. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it faint sounds of laughter and crying. I called out softly, "Daniel, if you're here, please find peace." In the growing darkness, a faint figure appeared near the cabin, a boy, translucent and pale, with sorrowful eyes. He looked at me, then smiled sadly before slowly fading away. The next morning, the footsteps stopped. The woods felt lighter, less oppressive. The camp continued as usual, but I never forgot that summer, the summer I came face to face with a restless spirit longing for peace. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The summer I was 19, I took a job as a camp counselor at a small rustic summer camp tucked deep in the forests of northern Michigan. The camp was called Cedar Pines, a place with a long history, over 80 years old, they said, with dozens of cabins, a lake for swimming, and miles of hiking trails. Most of the kids who came were from the city, looking for a taste of nature and adventure. I was eager for the job, hoping to escape my own city life and spend a few months outdoors, working with kids and making money. The first few weeks were everything I expected. Long days under the hot sun, the scent of pine needles, the cheerful laughter of campers, and the campfire stories told after lights out. The staff was friendly, and the campers were energetic, eager to learn canoeing, archery, and hiking. But beneath the cheerful surface, there was an unspoken tension among the older staff, something they never talked about openly. It started subtly, with small things. On the first night, I was assigned to cabin 13, one of the oldest cabins at the edge of the campgrounds. The cabin had a rough wooden porch with peeling paint and a creaky door. The counselor before me, Lisa, told me to lock the door tightly at night and keep the windows shut. "Don't leave the door open after dark," she warned. "Some people say weird things happen here." I smiled, brushing it off as campfire superstition. That first night, after the campers were asleep, I lay in my bunk, the warm summer air drifting through the open window. Suddenly I heard footsteps outside, soft, slow, pacing back and forth just beyond the porch. I got up to check, but saw nothing except the dark silhouettes of trees. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow over the woods. I chalked it up to animals or the wind playing tricks. But as nights went by, the noises grew more unsettling. Footsteps upstairs in the cabin's loft, where no one was supposed to be. Whispering voices so faint I couldn't make out the words. The old wooden floorboards creaking in patterns that sounded too deliberate to be random. One night, around midnight, I was woken by a soft knock on the cabin door. It was just one knock, gentle and slow. I froze. The camp was supposed to be quiet at this hour. I peeked outside and saw nothing but the shadows of trees swaying in the breeze. The knocking came again, twice more, then stopped. I told the senior counselors the next day. They smiled nervously. "That's just the camp's tradition," one of them said. "You'll get used to it." They never explained what tradition meant. Curiosity gnawed at me. I started asking questions about the camp's history. The director, Mr. Harris, was an older man, thin with a quiet demeanor. When I asked him about the cabin or the noises, he just said, "Cedar Pines has been around a long time. There are stories. Best not to dwell on them." One afternoon, while wandering near the lake, I stumbled upon a weathered old gravestone half buried beneath the roots of a giant cedar tree. The inscription was faded, but I could make out a name, Eleanor W., dated 1937. There was no cemetery nearby, just this solitary marker. I asked Mr. Harris about it. He sighed deeply and told me the story. Eleanor was a young girl who attended the camp as a camper in the 1930s. One summer, during a heat wave, she disappeared. They found her body in the lake days later. The official story was accidental drowning, but rumors circulated about strange occurrences, lights in the woods, voices calling her name, campers waking in the night to find Eleanor's apparition watching them. Her grave was never moved. It had become a sort of guardian spot, though many staff believed her spirit lingered, unable to leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. The summer heat was stifling, but the air felt heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard it again, the slow footsteps outside my cabin, the faint whispers carried on the breeze. Then, unmistakably, I heard a girl's voice calling my name. Soft, distant, but urgent. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The moonlight shimmered on the lake's surface, and the trees stood silent. I followed the voice toward the water's edge, heart pounding. There, reflected in the water, I saw her, a pale figure in a white dress, her eyes hollow, staring at me. She raised a hand slowly, beckoning me closer. I blinked, and she was gone. Terrified, I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Over the next week, the sightings increased. Campers whispered about a ghostly girl wandering the paths at dusk. Some claimed their things were moved or heard crying in the woods. I tried to keep calm, but the fear was growing in me. One evening, during a group campfire, I shared the story of Eleanor with the campers. Their faces turned pale. Some refused to join the campfire after dark. That night, several cabins reported strange noises, doors opening and closing by themselves, and cold spots that chilled the summer air. One of the counselors, Mark, decided to confront the spirit. He took a flashlight and went to Eleanor's grave by the cedar tree, promising to speak with her. We waited anxiously. Hours passed and Mark didn't return. Finally, around 2 a.m., he stumbled back to camp, pale and shaken. He refused to talk about what he saw, only whispering that Eleanor was trapped, angry, and lonely. The atmosphere in camp grew heavier. I felt watched constantly. My dreams were filled with water, drowning in a girl's desperate cries. One night, I woke to find the ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed. She reached out her hand, eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered. I nodded, trembling. In the days that followed, I researched old camp records and diaries in the town library. I found letters written by Eleanor's mother, describing her daughter's loneliness and fears. It seemed Eleanor had felt isolated, yearning for friendship and freedom. With this knowledge, I went to the cedar tree one last time, speaking aloud my hope that Eleanor would find peace. The air shifted, the heavy weight lifted. That summer ended with quiet nights, no more footsteps or whispers, but every now and then, when the cicadas sing on a hot July night, I swear I hear a soft voice calling my name from the woods. Story. The end.
Story number 3.
The summer I turned 21, I took a job as a lifeguard at a small, private lake club just outside a rural town in Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place where the world slowed down. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. I was looking forward to the summer. Long days, sun on my skin, and a bit of cash in my pocket. I had no idea what was waiting for me. The lake was surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles. The club was old, built back in the 1940s, with a main lodge, a few cabins, a dock, and a beach area. The locals had plenty of stories about the place. Nothing wild, just old campfire tales about the history of the land and the families who once lived there. But there was one story that stuck out. Something about a young woman named Lily who had drowned in the lake decades ago. No one ever really talked about it. Just a quiet nod when someone mentioned it, like it was better left alone. The first week on the job was routine. The sun beat down on the sand, kids splashed in the shallow end, and families lounged under umbrellas. I worked with 2 other lifeguards, Dave and Marcy, both locals who had been coming to the club for years. One evening, just after sunset, I was packing up when Marcy mentioned something strange. "Have you ever heard about the girl who drowned here?" she asked, eyes flicking toward the water. I nodded. "Yeah, Lily, right? The story about the drowning?" She looked uneasy. "Some say you can still hear her crying near the old dock at night." I laughed it off. "Sounds like a campfire story." But Marcy wasn't laughing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The summer heat kept the windows open, and I thought I heard faint sobbing carried on the breeze. I got up, looked outside, and the lake was calm, moonlight shimmering on the water's surface. I shrugged it off and went back to bed. The next day, strange things started happening. First, the whistle I used to signal the end of swim time disappeared. We searched everywhere, lost and found, the dock, the office, but it was gone. Then some chairs at the beach were moved as if someone had sat in them, but no one was around. A few kids complained about hearing whispers near the woods, but we chalked it up to imagination. On the third night, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The moon was nearly full, casting pale light across the water and into the trees. I walked down the main path toward the old dock, the one Marcy mentioned. The dock creaked beneath my feet. The air suddenly felt colder, and I shivered even though the summer night was warm. I heard it then, soft crying, almost like a child weeping. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered. I stood frozen for a moment, then decided to head back. As I turned, I saw her, a figure at the edge of the dock, a young woman in a white dress, long dark hair tangled around her face. Her eyes were wide, dark, and hollow. I blinked. She was gone. The next morning, I told Dave and Marcy what I saw. They exchanged looks but didn't say much. People say she comes back, Marcy said quietly, looking for something she lost. I asked if anyone had tried to help her, but they just shook their heads. That week, the sightings grew more frequent. Other lifeguards saw her too, a fleeting glimpse near the water's edge, a shadow just beyond the trees. Some of the kids reported feeling cold spots, like icy fingers brushing their skin. I started keeping a journal, writing down every experience, every strange sound, every shadow that moved where it shouldn't. One night after closing up, I stayed late to finish my notes. Around midnight, I heard footsteps behind the lodge. I turned and saw her again, the woman in white. This time she was closer, standing silently, her eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed hard and asked, "What do you want?" Her lips parted, and I heard a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, "Find him." Before I could say anything else, she vanished. The next day, I asked the older locals about Lily. An elderly man named Mr. Jenkins told me the story in full. Lily was the daughter of the family who originally owned the land. She was young and happy until one summer when she disappeared while swimming. They searched for days, but her body was never found. Some believed she drowned and was swept away. Others thought something more sinister had happened. "There was a man," Mr. Jenkins said, voice low. "Her boyfriend. He disappeared shortly after. Some say he knew what happened to her." I felt a chill. Could Lily's spirit be trapped here, searching for the truth? Determined to find answers, I started digging through old records and archives at the local library. I found an old newspaper clipping. Lily had been found drowned near the lake shore, her body pulled from the water a week after she disappeared. The boyfriend, named Paul, was suspected but never charged. His trail went cold after the summer ended. That night, I returned to the dock, clutching the photo I found in the archives, a faded picture of Lily smiling on the beach. I spoke into the night. "Lily, I'm trying to help you. What do you need?" The air grew icy. The figure appeared again, clearer this time. She pointed toward the forest behind the club. I followed, heart pounding, into the trees. There, half buried in the dirt, I found an old rusted locket with a photo inside, Paul's face. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. I felt a presence behind me, cold and oppressive. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I ran back to the lodge, the locket clutched tightly. The next day, I showed the locket to Mr. Jenkins. "He must have hidden this," he said grimly. "Maybe she never got justice." That night, for the first time in weeks, the lake was silent. No crying, no footsteps, no chilling presence. Lily was finally at peace. The summer ended, and I left Pine Brook with stories no one would believe. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear a soft whisper carried on the breeze. A thank you from the lake. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The summer after my senior year of high school, I decided to take a break from the usual beach vacations with my friends, and instead spent several weeks working at a small, family-owned campground in rural Pennsylvania. It was called Pine Ridge Camp, nestled deep within a stretch of dense woodland, a place where the air smelled like pine sap and earth, and the nights were alive with the chorus of crickets and owls. I'd found the job through a friend of a friend, just helping with maintenance, handing out firewood, managing the small camp store, and overseeing the occasional group of campers. It was the kind of place where cell service was spotty at best, the Wi-Fi non-existent, and the nearest town was miles away. I liked that. I wanted a summer where I could disconnect, unwind, and breathe. From the moment I arrived, the staff and locals were welcoming but reserved. There was an odd undercurrent to the place that no one ever openly mentioned, like there was something unsaid beneath the surface, a secret they didn't want visitors to uncover. The main lodge was an old wooden building that smelled of must and decades of campfire smoke. Behind it stretched rows of cabins, each spaced far enough apart to feel private, but close enough that you could hear neighbors' voices carried on the night breeze. The first few days passed without incident. The days were hot and sticky, filled with the buzz of insects and the occasional thud of a baseball on a nearby field. But the nights were where the atmosphere shifted. I often found myself lying awake, listening to sounds that didn't fit. The snapping of twigs in the woods just beyond the clearing, the rustle of leaves without wind, and sometimes a low, mournful sound that I couldn't place at first, a kind of soft wailing carried faintly through the trees. I mentioned the noise to one of the older staff members, Pete, who had worked at Pine Ridge for years. "Ah, that's just the woods talking," he said with a half smile. "Or maybe something else. You'll get used to it." He didn't elaborate, but his eyes darkened briefly. One evening, after the campers were asleep, I was walking back from the lake where I had been helping some kids with canoeing lessons. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep orange pink, and the first stars began to twinkle overhead. As I crossed a narrow footbridge over a small creek, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was a girl, maybe 14 or 15, wearing a white dress that looked old-fashioned. Her hair was long, dark, and hanging loose. She didn't move as I called out to her, and when I blinked, she was gone. I chalked it up to exhaustion or imagination. But over the next several nights, I saw her again, always at twilight, always just out of reach, watching silently from the edge of the woods near the creek. I started asking around, and the camp counselors exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Jenna, finally told me a story that chilled me to the bone. Years ago, she said, there was a camper who drowned in that creek. It was a hot July, just like now. They say she slipped, couldn't swim, and got pulled under by the current. Her name was Emily. I asked what happened after. No one ever really got closure. They found her body days later. After that, campers would sometimes hear her crying or see her near the water. The old-timers say she never left. I tried to keep a rational mindset. Water accidents happen, I told myself. Grief breeds stories. But when you see something that doesn't belong in the waking world, reason can feel very fragile. That night, I stayed up late in the lodge's porch swing, watching the stars and trying to relax. Around midnight, a sudden coldness swept over me, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Then I heard it, a faint sobbing, like a child crying quietly, carried on the wind. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the creek. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the water, heart pounding in my chest. The camp was silent except for the rustling trees and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. At the creek's edge, I saw her again, Emily's ghostly figure in the white dress, pale and shimmering in the moonlight. Her eyes were dark hollows, her mouth slightly open as if still crying. She raised a trembling hand, as if begging for help. I wanted to speak, to comfort her, but my voice stuck in my throat. Suddenly, the ground beneath me felt soft and unstable. I glanced down to see a muddy patch where the earth seemed freshly disturbed. A low, dark shape rippled just under the water, like a shadow waiting to drag something beneath the surface. Fear slammed into me, and I stumbled back, nearly falling. The figure disappeared into the night. The next day, I told the camp director, a middle-aged woman named Carol, about what I'd seen. She frowned and warned me to be careful. "Emily's story is sad," she said quietly, "but this place has history. Things happened here long before the camp was built. Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried." I pushed her for details, and eventually she told me about a tragedy that predated the camp itself. Decades ago, the land had been a private estate. A wealthy family had owned it, living in a grand house near where the lodge now stood. One summer, the daughter of the family vanished. Her name was Lillian. The police searched but never found her. Rumor had it she ran away after some terrible event, something whispered about but never confirmed. Not long after, the estate burned down in a suspicious fire, leaving only ruins. The land was later sold and converted into the camp. Locals claimed Lillian's spirit lingered, lost and restless, sometimes mistaken for the drowned camper's ghost. That night, the wailing came again, louder this time. I lay in my cabin, the thin walls offering little protection from the sounds. The air grew cold and thick, pressing against me. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the threshold. The shape was tall, slender, and flickered like a candle flame. I froze, unable to move. The figure glided into the room, and I caught a glimpse of a pale face, haunted eyes staring deep into mine. Then the room filled with a choking cold, and I lost consciousness. I woke up hours later, the first light of dawn filtering through the windows. The cabin was empty, no sign of the figure. I packed my things that morning. I couldn't stay. As I was leaving, I noticed a small, weathered photograph pinned to the bulletin board in the lodge. A black and white picture of a young woman standing on a porch, smiling faintly. A name was scrawled beneath it, Lillian. I turned and looked back toward the woods one last time. The summer sun was bright and warm, the trees swaying gently, but I knew the woods were not as peaceful as they seemed. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The summer of 1997 is etched in my memory as a season of sweltering heat, lazy afternoons, and a darkness that stretched far beyond the long golden days. It was the summer I returned to the small town where I grew up, a quiet place nestled deep in the Pennsylvania countryside. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business and where the past seemed to linger just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to slip back into view. I was 19, home for the summer after my freshman year of college, working odd jobs to save money. One evening, I was driving out toward the old Miller farm on the edge of town, a place I'd heard about since childhood but never dared to explore. The Miller farm had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a tragedy no one liked to talk about. According to local lore, Sarah Miller, the youngest daughter of the family, had disappeared one scorching summer night back in the 1950s. Some said she ran away, others whispered of something darker. The farm had sat empty ever since, the buildings slowly crumbling, swallowed by the relentless woods. That night, I found myself curious enough to stop by. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields as I parked my car by the cracked dirt road. The farmhouse was a skeleton of its former self. Broken windows, sagging porch, peeling paint, and the wild overgrowth that had taken over the yard. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and old decay. As I stepped out, the cicadas were loud, an unending chorus of summer. I moved cautiously toward the house, my flashlight cutting through the gathering twilight. The front door hung ajar, creaking slightly as a warm breeze pushed it. Inside, the house was dark, the walls stained yellow with age. Dust motes floated in the beam of my light. It smelled of mildew and something else, something faintly sweet like old perfume. I shivered despite the heat. In the living room, the furniture was covered in sheets, and old family portraits hung crooked on the walls. I spotted a faded photograph on a table near the fireplace. It showed a smiling young woman in a white dress. Sarah, I presumed. Her eyes seemed almost alive, watching me as I moved. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs made me freeze. It was soft, like footsteps on wooden floorboards. My heart hammered, and I debated turning back. But curiosity pushed me onward. I climbed the narrow staircase slowly, each creak echoing in the stillness. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness. I pointed my light toward the far end and saw a door slightly open. The glow from outside the house spilled faintly through the crack. Pushing the door gently, I entered what must have been Sarah's bedroom. It was empty except for a small vanity, its mirror cracked and dusty. I noticed a small music box on the dresser, covered in a thick layer of dust. Carefully, I lifted the lid. The faint sound of a lullaby played, tinny and warped by time. That's when I heard it. Soft whispering, almost unintelligible, but close. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but no one was there. "Who's there?" I called, voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then a sudden coldness swept through the room, so intense that I could see my breath. The temperature dropped from stifling summer heat to icy chill in seconds. The hairs on my arms stood up. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, a flicker like a shadow passing behind the curtains. I told myself it was my imagination, nerves getting the best of me. As I turned to leave, the music box stopped abruptly. Downstairs, I heard a faint sobbing. It was soft, mournful, like a woman crying in pain. The sound seemed to come from outside the house, drifting through the open window. I stepped out onto the porch, heart pounding. The sun was gone now, and the sky had turned a deep indigo, stars just beginning to blink awake. The sobbing continued, now clearer. It was coming from the woods behind the house. The trees loomed, thick and dark. I hesitated, then followed the sound along a narrow trail overgrown with brambles and wildflowers. Deeper into the woods, the sobbing turned to whispered words. "Help me." The voice was unmistakably female, young, desperate, pleading. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled and caught myself on an old wooden fence post, which groaned and cracked as I leaned on it. I looked down and saw an old grave marker barely visible through the weeds, a small wooden cross, weathered and broken. The name was faint, but I could just make out the letters. Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. I sank to my knees, heart racing. The sobbing stopped abruptly. In the silence, a soft breeze whispered through the leaves, carrying a faint scent of lilies and earth. I felt as if I was being watched. I stood, backing slowly away from the grave, and headed back toward the house. As I crossed the clearing, a figure appeared just at the edge of the trees, a woman in white, translucent, her hair flowing in the breeze like seaweed. Her eyes were sad and endless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Then she turned and disappeared into the forest. I ran the rest of the way back to my car, adrenaline carrying me through the thickets and shadows. When I reached the road, I stopped and looked back. The woods were still again, silent but for the rustling leaves. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the woman haunted me. Her face, her sorrow. I thought about the stories of the Miller family and the unanswered questions. The next day, I went to the local library to search for more information. I found newspaper articles about Sarah's disappearance, a heatwave summer, a report of a young woman seen wandering near the lake, and finally, her body discovered days later, drowned. The official cause, accidental drowning, but rumors spoke of a lover's quarrel and a secret no one wanted revealed. I spent the rest of the summer drawn back to the Miller farm. Each night, the crying would start just as the sun set, and each night I would wander the woods, searching for some sign, some peace, for Sarah's restless spirit. One evening, I found an old diary buried beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse, its pages yellowed and fragile. It was Sarah's. She wrote of loneliness, fear, and a secret relationship that her family disapproved of. The last entry was a desperate plea for freedom. The words echoed in my mind as I pieced together the story. A young woman trapped by her family and fate, lost to the lake and the woods. On the last night of summer, I stood by the grave again, holding the diary. The air was thick with silence. A gentle wind stirred, and the figure appeared once more. This time she smiled, a faint, thankful smile, and slowly faded into the night air. The crying ceased. The farm fell silent, and the summer heat gave way to the cool touch of autumn. I left the Miller farm behind that year, but the memory of Sarah's story stayed with me, a haunting reminder that some spirits never rest until their truth is known. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The summer I spent at my uncle's lake house was supposed to be a break from city life, a chance to relax and enjoy the slow pace of a small town tucked away in northern Michigan. The days were hot and sticky, and the nights were filled with the chirping of crickets and the soft rustling of the pines that surrounded the property. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the endless blue sky, dotted with fluffy white clouds that drifted lazily. But beneath that tranquil surface, something dark lingered, something I wouldn't understand until it was too late. My uncle, an easygoing man in his 60s, had owned the house for over 30 years. It was a weathered, 2-story cabin with creaky floors and a wraparound porch that overlooked the water. The locals told me stories about the lake, how it was beautiful but dangerous, and how something had happened there long ago, something no one really talked about anymore. I was young, skeptical, and more interested in swimming and fishing than ghost stories, so I didn't pay much attention. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake early, watch the sunrise over the water, and spend afternoons swimming or hiking nearby trails. The lake was cool, inviting, and I never felt unsafe. But as the week went on, subtle things began to change. It started with the feeling that I was being watched. While I sat reading on the porch or fished from the dock, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, something slipping behind the trees or just beyond the edge of the water. I told myself it was wildlife or a trick of the light. One afternoon, after a heavy thunderstorm rolled through, I found something strange near the water's edge. A small, worn wooden box, partially buried in the muddy sand. It was old and covered in algae, as if it had been underwater for years. Inside, wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, was a faded photograph of a young woman smiling, standing on the very dock where I had found the box. I showed it to my uncle, who frowned deeply but didn't say much. "Must have belonged to someone a long time ago," he said, shrugging. "People lose things. The lake keeps them safe, or so it seems." That night I dreamed of the woman in the photo. She was standing by the dock, staring out at the lake, her eyes full of sorrow. Her dress was white, stained with something dark, that looked like mud or blood. She reached out to me, but before I could take her hand, she vanished beneath the water. I woke up sweating, the sound of waves lapping against the shore echoing faintly through the open window. Outside, the moon was full and cast a silver glow on the lake. Over the next few days, the dreams grew more vivid. The woman appeared more often, sometimes standing just beyond the edge of the trees, watching silently. At times, I thought I heard soft singing, a melancholy lullaby carried on the breeze. One evening, I decided to explore the forest along the lake's shore. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. As I walked, the temperature dropped suddenly, and an unnatural chill crawled up my spine. The forest grew silent. The usual chorus of insects and birds vanished. Ahead, I saw her, standing beneath a large oak tree, the woman from my dreams. Her dress billowed gently despite the still air, and her eyes were fixed on me. "Who are you?" I whispered. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a feeling of overwhelming sadness washed over me. I stepped closer, and she reached out again, her fingers translucent and trembling. I wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but a voice inside warned me not to. Suddenly the ground shifted beneath me, and I stumbled backward. My flashlight flickered and died. In the pitch-black forest, I felt cold hands brush my skin and heard faint whispers in a language I couldn't understand. I ran. Back at the cabin, my uncle was waiting on the porch, his face pale and worried. "You shouldn't be out there after dark," he said quietly. "There's a story you need to know." He told me about Emily, a young woman who had lived on the lake in the early 1900s. She had been engaged to a man who went off to war and never returned. Heartbroken, Emily wandered the woods near the lake every night, waiting for him. One summer, during a terrible storm, she disappeared. Her body was never found, but the locals believed she drowned in the lake, forever trapped between this world and the next. Some said she sang to the stars, calling out to her lost love. Others claimed she was angry, and anyone who disturbed the lake after sunset would pay the price. The summer wore on. My dreams worsened, and the woman's appearances became more frequent and desperate. One night, I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and filled with tears. She reached out, whispering my name. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to find a way to help her. With my uncle's hesitant blessing, I sought out the town historian, a woman named Mrs. Caldwell. She had spent years researching the lake's history and the Miller family, who had lived nearby during Emily's time. Mrs. Caldwell showed me old letters and journals that revealed a tragic secret. Emily had discovered her fiancé was already married, and in her despair she planned to escape, but someone had stopped her, possibly the husband or a jealous rival. Her death was covered up to protect reputations. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the lake at dusk, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and the letters. I spoke aloud, promising to tell Emily's story, to clear her name and help her find peace. The air shifted, and the woman appeared once more. This time, her expression softened. She took the flowers gently, and as the last light faded, she smiled, a bittersweet, grateful smile, and slipped beneath the water. From that night on, the lake was silent. No more whispers, no more shadows watching from the trees. I left the cabin at the end of the summer, but the memory of Emily stayed with me, a reminder that even in the brightest summers, shadows can linger, and some spirits need our help to finally rest. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the summer of 2016 when I spent the hottest 3 months of my life in a small, sticky town called Boone Hollow, tucked deep into the Carolina backwoods. I was 25, broke, and burned out from my miserable retail job in Raleigh. A friend of a friend hooked me up with a paid research internship at a tiny historical preservation group based in Boone Hollow. My job was simple: spend the summer cataloging and documenting several abandoned homes and structures in the area for potential preservation grants. It sounded easy, and it was, until I started working on the old Brennan place. Locals called it the Hollow House. Everyone seemed to know about it, but no one really talked about it. Not directly. Every time I mentioned it, someone's expression would sour, eyes would drop, conversations would shift. The house was deep in the woods, down an overgrown trail a few miles off the main road. It was barely visible through the canopy of oaks and maples that strangled the path. I had to hike in with water, a notebook, my phone, which never had service, and a small shoulder bag with my supplies. The first time I laid eyes on the Brennan house, I remember stopping in my tracks. It wasn't falling apart like I'd expected. It was still almost too intact, as if time had passed around it. The roof sagged slightly, and the wood was weathered, but the porch was stable, the windows were mostly intact, and the air around it felt dense, like walking into a room right after someone had been crying. I spent that first week just walking the perimeter, sketching and jotting down notes. I didn't go inside until the second Monday of June. The front door, though swollen from years of humidity, pushed open with a groan. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not rot or mildew, but something faintly sweet and deeply wrong, like fruit left out in the sun too long. Inside, the house was layered in dust, but undisturbed. Old furniture still stood where it had been left. Couches, chairs, a grandfather clock. Everything felt paused. I set up a small folding table near the entryway where I could spread out my materials, and I returned each day that week to continue my survey. The strangest part at first was how quiet it was. No bird calls. No insects, not even the usual creaks of an old house settling. It was so quiet I could hear the blood in my ears. By the third week, I had finished documenting the first floor and had started making sketches of the upstairs bedrooms. That was when things started to turn. On Wednesday, I noticed something I was sure I would have seen before. A large gouge across the hallway floorboards upstairs, like something had been dragged from one room to another. I knelt down and traced it with my finger. The wood was splintered, sharp at the edges, fresh. I convinced myself I had simply missed it earlier. But on Thursday, when I returned, the gouge was gone. I stood there, staring at the smooth floor, feeling a cold chill run down my spine despite the sticky summer heat. I turned to leave, but stopped at the top of the stairs when I saw something small and pale resting on the bottom step. It was a porcelain button. Old, smooth, yellowed with age. I hadn't seen it before, and I hadn't brought it. I pocketed it without thinking and left for the day. That night, in my rented room above the local diner, I had a dream. I was standing in the Brennan house, but it wasn't abandoned. It was lit with oil lamps. The furniture was clean. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock, and there was a sound upstairs, quiet at first, a soft thump, then another. I walked toward the staircase, heart hammering like, and as I put my foot on the bottom step, I saw her. A girl, maybe 15, in a white nightgown, standing halfway up the stairs, staring down at me with wide, wet eyes. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, there was a choking, gurgling sound. I woke up gasping. The next morning, I checked my bag and pulled out the porcelain button. It was ice cold, slick with condensation, as if I had just pulled it out of a freezer. I should have left it then. Should have walked away, but I didn't. On Friday, I arrived at the Brennan house later than usual. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled like rain. Inside, the house was darker than normal, like the walls had absorbed the storm before it even broke. I climbed the stairs again and entered the largest bedroom. The bed was still there, stripped bare, a thick layer of dust coating the frame. As I turned to leave, I heard it, just barely. A whisper. I froze. It was the kind of whisper you don't quite hear with your ears, more like you feel it in the back of your mind. A word, stretched and slow. Stop. I spun around. No one. The room was empty. I left immediately, nearly tripping down the stairs in my rush. That weekend, I did some digging. I drove to the county records office, where a friendly clerk named Troy helped me find documents on the Brennan family. According to old files, the house had belonged to John and Margaret Brennan, who had a daughter named Claire. In 1923, Claire went missing. Her body was never found. Her parents both died within the year. Margaret from what was listed as melancholia, and John from a fall off the upstairs landing. I returned to the house the following Monday, more determined than afraid. I had brought a small recorder to capture audio and document any strange occurrences. I turned it on and started my walkthrough from the front door, narrating as I moved. When I climbed the stairs, I spoke about the gouge that had appeared and vanished. I entered Claire's bedroom and stopped short. On the bed, in the center of the dusty frame, was a neatly folded white nightgown. I hadn't put it there. The audio recorder in my hand suddenly crackled and popped, the sound of static bursting in my ears. I held it up, and a faint voice cut through, distorted and garbled. I played it back right there. It repeated the same word over and over again. Help! Help, help. I left. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the image of the nightgown or the whisper or the girl in my dream. On Tuesday, I returned one last time. I had to understand what was happening. I entered the house and climbed the stairs, heart pounding. When I reached Claire's room, the nightgown was gone. In its place, on the bed, was a photograph. An old black and white picture of a young girl sitting on that very bed. She was smiling faintly, her hands folded in her lap. On the back was a date, June 13th, 1923. That was the day she vanished. I took the photo and left, but I never made it to the trailhead. About halfway back through the woods, the sky cracked open with thunder. Rain poured in sheets, and the trail became slick with mud. I stumbled, fell, and rolled down a short embankment, my shoulder slamming into a rock. When I sat up, dazed and bleeding, I realized I was no longer alone. Standing at the top of the embankment was a girl in a white nightgown, soaked, barefoot, her hair hanging in wet clumps across her face. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, looking at me. I scrambled to my feet, too afraid to speak. She tilted her head slowly, as if trying to understand me, and then she mouthed something, just one word. Please. Then she was gone. When I reached the road, soaked and shivering, I drove straight to the historical center and handed everything over. Photos, audio, sketches, the recorder. I told them I wouldn't go back. The Brennan house still stands in those woods. Last I heard, the group abandoned plans to restore it. Too many setbacks. Too many accidents. Sometimes in the middle of summer, I'll wake in the night to the sound of a soft voice saying my name. I don't know if it's a dream. I don't know if Claire ever really left that house or if a part of her followed me, but I still have the button. I tried throwing it away once. The next morning, it was back on my nightstand. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was the summer of 2008 when I moved into an old rental house with two college friends, Brian and Jacob, just outside a small town in central North Carolina. The house was set far back from the road, tucked into a line of trees that looked like they hadn't been trimmed in years. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time. Paint chipped from the wood siding, rust streaks down the sides of the metal roof, and a front porch that sagged in the middle. The landlord gave us a good deal on rent because, as he put it, no one sticks around long. We laughed it off. College kids don't care about creepy vibes when the rent is cheap and there's a fire pit in the backyard. The house had 3 bedrooms and a narrow, dim hallway that always smelled faintly of damp wood. My room was the last on the left, furthest from the front door and closest to the back exit, which was a crooked screen door that slammed shut every time someone let go of it. At first, it felt like the perfect setup. Long summer days filled with junk food, music, cheap beer, and nowhere we really needed to be. The weirdness started on the 4th night. It was around 3 a.m. I was lying in bed with the fan blowing directly on me. The house was so hot during the summer that we'd all just leave our doors open to get any airflow. I heard the unmistakable creak of footsteps down the hallway, slow, deliberate, heavier than either Brian or Jacob. I figured maybe one of them had gotten up to pee and was just messing around, but then I heard it stop right outside my door. I sat up. There was no shadow under the doorway, no movement, no sound. Just stillness. Brian? I whispered. Nothing. Jacob? Still nothing. I stood up and poked my head out into the hallway. No one was there. I went to each of their rooms. Both were sound asleep, doors half open. The next morning I asked them, but they both swore they never left their rooms. Jacob even laughed and asked if I was still high from the night before. I wasn't. I knew what I heard. A few nights later, it happened again. This time I was already awake. I'd gotten up to get a drink from the kitchen. As I passed the hallway closet, which we almost never used, I noticed it was slightly open. That struck me as odd, because I distinctly remembered closing it the day before. I reached for the doorknob to shut it when I heard a quiet sound, like breathing. I froze. It was subtle, but rhythmic, shallow, like someone crouching inside, trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I just stood there, hand inches from the door, while whatever was on the other side kept breathing. I don't remember how long I stood there. It felt like an hour, though it couldn't have been more than a minute. Eventually, I backed away slowly and returned to my room. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, when the sun was up and the house felt safe again, I opened the closet. Nothing. Just a mop, a box of old light bulbs, and some paint cans. Weird things began piling up. Doors would open or close on their own. Lights would flicker. Not all at once, just one or two bulbs in different rooms, as if they were reacting to something moving through the house. Jacob's stereo turned on by itself in the middle of the night, full volume, static blaring. One morning, we found all the cabinet doors in the kitchen wide open. Brian thought it was a prank, but Jacob and I both had been asleep, and the front and back doors were locked from the inside. I started to feel watched. All the time, especially in my room. There was one spot in the corner, just above the closet, where the shadows seemed darker. Not like it was poorly lit, more like the shadows were deeper than they should have been, like they had weight. I avoided looking directly at it, but I could feel it, always in the corner of my vision. Jacob was the first to talk about the dreams. He said he kept seeing a figure standing at the end of his bed. Tall, gaunt, no face, just darkness where the features should be. He said it didn't move, didn't speak, but he woke up drenched in sweat every time. Brian teased him about it until 2 nights later when he came into the kitchen, white as a sheet, saying he'd seen it too. One night, we were all in the living room watching a movie. The TV flickered once, then again, and shut off completely. Then the lights dimmed. And for just a second, maybe 2, we all heard it. Footsteps above us. But here's the thing. We didn't have an upstairs. The attic had no flooring, no furniture, and wasn't accessible except through a pull-down ladder in the hallway. But the steps were clear, slow, like someone pacing. Jacob grabbed a flashlight, and we all stood beneath the attic door. We didn't say anything, just listened. The footsteps stopped. Then something dropped. A loud thud, like a heavy box being dropped onto the floor just above our heads. Jacob pulled the cord and the attic stairs creaked down. None of us wanted to go up there, but we did. Together. The flashlight flickered as we climbed. The air in the attic was suffocating, like the heat had doubled in that space. There was nothing up there, no box, no footprints in the dust, just silence and that thick, oppressive air pressing down on us. We didn't sleep well after that. Brian left first. He packed up his stuff one morning after waking up with scratches down his back. He claimed it was from our cat, but we didn't have a cat. He said he was going to stay with his girlfriend for a few days and never came back. Jacob and I stayed, mostly because we didn't have anywhere else to go. But we stopped hanging out in the common areas. We barely talked. We slept with the lights on. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was coming from my closet. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft rhythm of them, like chanting. I thought about running, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the closet door. And then it opened. Just a crack. That was enough. I screamed. Jacob burst into the room, baseball bat in hand, and the whispering stopped. We searched the closet. Nothing. But from that point on, we slept in the same room. We couldn't take it alone anymore. Then came the worst night. It was mid-July, hotter than hell. We were both in my room, barely dozing. Sometime around 2 a.m., every light in the house turned on at once. We jumped up, startled, and then the front door slammed. Hard. Then the back door. Then my closet door. It was like the whole house was reacting to something moving through it violently, angrily. The air was thick and heavy, and we both felt it, that horrible sense that something else was in the room with us. We heard footsteps in the hallway. Not walking. Running. Back and forth, over and over. We locked the door. We had no weapons, just a lamp and a folding chair. Then the hallway went silent. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing. Then came 3 knocks on our door. Not loud. Not hard. Just 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. Jacob whispered, "Don't open it." I wasn't planning to. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, we packed our bags and left. We didn't even bother telling the landlord. We just drove. Jacob went home to his parents. I crashed with a friend in Raleigh. A few weeks later, I did some digging. Turns out the house had a history. A woman named Leanne lived there in the late 70s. She had 2 sons and was in the middle of a bitter divorce. Her husband wanted custody, and things got ugly. One night, neighbors heard screaming, but no one called the police. The next morning, the boys were found in their beds, dead, smothered. Leanne's body was never found. Some say she drowned herself in the river a few miles down. Others think she never left the house. I don't know if that story is true. I don't know what we experienced that summer. But I do know this. Whatever was in that house wasn't just a story. It wasn't a creaky pipe or a draft or my imagination. It was real, and it followed me. After I moved back to the city, things started happening again. Lights turning on by themselves, footsteps in the hallway. I heard the whispering once more, faint but familiar. I moved again and again. It hasn't stopped. Some nights I wake up to 3 soft knocks on my bedroom door. Story the end.
Story number 9.
In the summer of 2019, I agreed to house sit for my cousin Rebecca and her husband Mark while they took their 2 daughters on a road trip up the East Coast. They lived in a quiet town in rural Vermont, a picturesque place with rolling hills, sprawling farmlands, and dense woods that always smelled of damp pine and wildflowers. Their house was an old colonial-style 2-story with a wraparound porch, tall windows, and hardwood floors that creaked in oddly specific places. They lived far enough out that there were no close neighbors, just woods on all sides, with a thin gravel road leading out to the main highway. When I first arrived, it felt peaceful, isolated but relaxing. Rebecca left me a long list of things to do: water the plants, feed the cat, a chubby tabby named Clem, check the mail, and make sure the basement dehumidifier stayed emptied. Pretty standard stuff. She didn't mention anything odd, but looking back, there were signs I probably should have noticed. The first few days passed quietly. I spent most of my time reading on the porch, enjoying the breeze and the hum of insects. Occasionally I'd hear rustling from the woods, but it was always during daylight, and I figured it was just deer or raccoons. The real unease didn't start until the 5th night, when I woke around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought it might be Clem, but Clem was curled at the foot of my bed, snoring gently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving across the hall above me. The house had 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, 2 for the kids and 1 master. No one was supposed to be home. My heart started pounding in my ears. I sat up and strained to listen. The steps paused, then resumed, as if whoever or whatever it was had noticed I was awake. I was too scared to move, too afraid that making a noise would invite something I couldn't explain. Eventually, the sound stopped. I waited almost an hour before I mustered the courage to go upstairs. I crept up, flashlight in hand, and checked each room. All empty. Nothing disturbed. I chalked it up to the house settling, though a part of me knew better. The next day, I called Rebecca under the pretense of asking about a plant. I casually asked if they ever heard strange noises at night. There was a pause on her end of the line, long enough to make my skin crawl. Then she laughed a little, unconvincingly, and said, "Oh, old house sounds, right? Sometimes it creaks at night." She changed the subject immediately. I told myself I was being paranoid. I left lights on that night, hoping it would make me feel less alone. Around 3 a.m. I woke again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps. It was humming, a soft, tuneless melody, barely audible, drifting down the stairs. It was a woman's voice. I froze. Breath caught in my throat. The humming stopped as soon as I moved to sit up. Clem hissed, something I had never heard him do, and bolted under the bed. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight app, then crept out into the hall. Every part of me screamed not to go upstairs, but I couldn't let it go. I had to see. The hallway on the 2nd floor was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick like walking through a fog. I stepped into the master bedroom. Nothing. Then the left bedroom, nothing again. But when I stepped into the smaller right side room, the room Rebecca said the youngest daughter, Emma, used, I nearly dropped my phone. The closet door was wide open. When I'd checked the room earlier that day, it had been closed. Inside the closet, everything looked normal at first. Then I noticed the far back panel had been moved aside, revealing a small crawl space. I hadn't known that was there. The darkness beyond was complete. It wasn't a normal dark. It felt wrong, like the kind of darkness that eats light. I backed out of the room and shut the door, heart slamming against my ribs. I slept downstairs on the couch that night, all the lights blazing. Clem didn't come out from under the bed until the morning. The next day, I considered leaving. I even packed a bag, but something kept me there, a feeling that if I left without knowing what was going on, it wouldn't stay behind. That night, I heard the humming again. This time, it came from downstairs. I crept down the hallway, the same melody threading through the air. It was louder, more distinct. I followed it to the living room. At first, there was nothing. Then the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The humming stopped abruptly. In its place, a low whisper. "Help me." I turned slowly and saw her. A woman stood in the corner by the fireplace. Pale skin, long wet hair hanging down in front of her face, and wearing what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown. She wasn't quite solid, flickering slightly like an image on a broken TV screen. Her head tilted to one side, and her mouth opened again, but no sound came out. I blinked, and she was gone. I ran out of the house and didn't go back until daylight. When I finally returned, everything looked normal. I convinced myself it was sleep deprivation, stress, imagination, anything but what I knew I'd seen. The last night in that house was the worst. It started with Clem vanishing. I'd seen him lounging on the porch at dusk, but by the time the sun went down, he hadn't come back. I searched all around the property, calling for him, shaking his food container. Nothing. As I stepped back inside, I felt it immediately. The shift. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. Every shadow felt deeper, every creak of the house sharper. I shut and locked every door and window and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, hands trembling. At 1:47 a.m., the lights went out. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no crickets, no sound at all. Then the humming started again. But this time, it was all around me. I grabbed my flashlight and backed toward the stairs. The light flickered and died. I was plunged into pitch black, and then I heard them. Multiple sets of footsteps, some light and quick, others heavy and dragging. I turned to run and slammed straight into something solid. I fell back, hit my head against the floor, and everything went dark for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes, the flashlight had rolled away, casting a dim beam across the floor. I could see them now. Bare feet. 4 pairs, standing just inches from me. I couldn't look up. I couldn't move. A whisper filled my ears, more urgent this time. "You have to see it." One of the figures knelt. I felt cold fingers grip my chin and tilt my head upward. I finally saw her face. It was the woman. But her eyes were gone, just dark, sunken pits, and her mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and let out a scream so loud and piercing that I felt it in my bones. Then everything went silent. I woke up at dawn, lying on the kitchen floor. My flashlight was off, my phone was dead, and Clem was sitting by the back door, staring at me. I left that morning without finishing the rest of the house sitting. I didn't tell Rebecca or Mark the full story, just said I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. They were understanding, if a little confused. A few weeks later, Rebecca called me. She asked if I had opened the crawl space in Emma's room. I said no, and she went quiet again. Then she said something I still think about constantly. Emma's been talking to someone in the room at night. She says the lady in the closet wants to play hide and seek. They moved out less than 6 months later. The house sat vacant for over a year before it was finally bought by a couple from Massachusetts. I don't know if they ever stayed longer than a few weeks. The house is back on the market now. I still think about that woman. The way she hummed, the way she screamed. Sometimes, on warm summer nights when the wind is still and the woods are quiet, I hear it again. That soft, tuneless melody floating just outside my window. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was the summer of 2013, and I had just finished my first year of college. I was 19, broke, and desperately trying to avoid spending the whole summer with my parents in Raleigh. When my cousin Aaron offered me a chance to stay at his place for free in a small lakeside town called Waterville, I jumped at it. He was leaving for a 2-month hiking trip through the Rockies and needed someone to house sit his place, water the plants, and check the mail. Waterville wasn't much more than a collection of houses, a gas station, a diner, and a public dock on the lake. It was quiet, a little too quiet for someone like me used to late-night pizza joints and downtown noise. But the town had its charm, green trees that stretched over long country roads, the constant chirp of insects in the evening, and water that reflected the sky like a mirror. Aaron's house sat right on the edge of town, close to the lake, nestled between patches of thick woods. It was an old cottage, 2 stories, creaky floors, and windows that never seemed to fully close. The first week passed uneventfully. I read books, took walks, swam in the lake, and got to know a few of the locals. One of them, an older man named Roy, who ran the bait shop near the dock, warned me not to go out on the lake after dark. I laughed it off, assuming it was one of those small town superstitions. He didn't laugh back. He just said, "There's something wrong with that water after sunset. You stay away." I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked away. But curiosity gnawed at me. One night, about 2 weeks into my stay, I was sitting on the back deck with a beer, staring out at the lake. The air was thick and humid, and the sun had dipped below the trees. The water was glassy and still. Too still. It was then I saw something, or someone, standing near the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was a deer or an animal, but the shape didn't move like one. It stood upright. It wasn't looking at me, at least I don't think it was, but it didn't move. I blinked, and it was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, maybe my imagination. But I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the porch, a creaking sound outside my window. When I looked, no one was there. The next day, I found muddy footprints on the deck. They led from the woods toward the back door, then stopped. There were no signs of anyone breaking in, no disturbed grass, nothing missing, just muddy prints that ended right at the screen door. I didn't call anyone. I told myself someone was messing with me. Some local kid playing a joke on the outsider. A few nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of splashing. Not loud, but persistent. I looked out my window and saw ripples moving across the lake as though someone or something was wading through the shallows. I stared, trying to see if anyone was out there, but it was too dark. I went outside with a flashlight, heart thudding, and pointed it toward the dock. There were wet footprints on the wooden boards. Human footprints. Bare feet. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" Silence. Then a whisper. From behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just trees. That was the moment I truly felt it, this heavy electric pressure in the air. Like something watching me, not from one direction, but from all around. I backed up slowly, locked the door behind me, and stayed up the rest of the night. The next day, I went into town to talk to Roy. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask for details. "People don't listen," he said, shaking his head. "That lake's got things in it, old things." I pressed him for more. He told me a story about a girl who drowned in the lake 40 years ago. Her name was Lily. She went missing during a summer party on the dock. Everyone was drinking. No one noticed she was gone until the next morning. They found her body days later, tangled in weeds, eyes wide open. But that wasn't the part that got people talking. The strange thing was, even after her funeral, folks started seeing her, standing in the woods, walking along the shore, staring from the water's edge. Not just one or two people, dozens. "They say she never left," Roy said quietly. "They say the lake kept something of her." He warned me again, "Stay inside after dark. Don't swim at night. Don't even go near the water." I tried, I really did, but I started hearing her voice. The first time was in the shower, a soft hum, a melody that didn't match anything I knew. It echoed in the steam, delicate and slow. I turned off the water and stood there, that's naked and dripping, heart racing. The house was silent. Then I heard it again a few nights later, outside my bedroom window, a girl's voice humming, then whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I stayed in the middle of my room that night, far from the windows, knife in hand. Every night after that, something happened. Footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering even though there was no storm. The fridge door would be wide open when I came downstairs. Once, every faucet in the house turned on at once. But the worst part was the whispering. Always whispering. Right at the edge of hearing. It came from the vents, the sink drains, the windows. Sometimes it said my name. I called Aaron. I told him what was happening, and he went silent. After a long pause, he said, "You're not the first. I had some weird stuff happen there too, but I thought it was just old house noises." He told me to leave if I felt unsafe. I didn't need his permission. That night, I packed my bags. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning. I didn't care about the plants or the mail. I just wanted out. But I didn't make it to morning. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps inside the house. Not on the porch. Inside. I grabbed my phone, but it was dead, though it had been charging. I grabbed the same knife from before and crept into the hallway. Every light was off. The house was pitch black. Then I heard humming, coming from the kitchen. I moved slowly, my bare feet barely touching the floor. When I got to the kitchen doorway, I peeked in, and I saw her. A girl, soaking wet, with hair hanging in front of her face, standing in front of the sink. She was humming softly, swaying slightly, and water dripped from her dress, forming a dark puddle on the floor. She stopped humming and slowly turned toward me. Her eyes were missing, just two black, gaping sockets where they should have been. I dropped the knife. I don't know if I screamed or not, but I ran. Straight out the front door, into the woods, barefoot and blind with panic. I didn't stop running until I reached Roy's shop, banging on the door like a madman. He let me in, didn't ask questions, just gave me a blanket and sat with me until the sun came up. I left town that morning. I never went back. I've tried to explain it all away, stress, hallucinations, sleep paralysis, but none of it fits. The things I saw, heard, felt. I wasn't the only one. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear her humming, always from the bathroom drain, always when the house is quiet, and I never swim after dark. Story the end.